Axiom Verge and Environmental Station Alpha are two independent games which were each developed primarily by a single person and released within 1 month of each other. While it's not surprising to see them share some similarities, considering how they were both heavily influenced by Metroid, what did strike me was how different their weaknesses and strengths were despite that shared inspiration. I think it's worth highlighting what they did better in comparison to each other, so in this video I'll be contrasting their approaches to various aspects of their design, which will hopefully give us a better appreciation of them both. The first immediately striking difference between the two games will be the graphics. Both use relatively simplistic pixelated sprites, but Axiom Verge has a much higher level of detail than Station Alpha. While Axiom Verge looks like an overclocked SNES title, Station Alpha looks like it's caught in some weird limbo between early console generations. If this is your first time seeing Station Alpha, it might be pretty tough on your eyes. The extremely low effective resolution can make it difficult to parse even simple details at first, but it does get better once you settle into a proper play session. Even so, the graphics don't serve the art direction as well as they do in Axiom Verge. It turns out that this kind of sprite art is actually pretty good at replicating the incomprehensible, borderline surreal nature of H.R. Giger's art, where Axiom Verge draws much of its inspiration. There's enough detail to show complex machinery, but not enough to clearly discern its purpose. Some of the effects in Station Alpha can be charming in their own simplicity, like the twinkling stars in the outdoor scenes, but for the most part the visuals are excessively low fidelity. There would be more to be gained by increasing the resolution than would be lost. It seems clear which game had more effort put into its assets, but when it comes to utilizing those assets, Station Alpha actually does a better job. Take a look at this scene here. The cave has clearly defined walls and floors with a solid line denoting the play area. Beyond the boundary, the sprites are dithered so the walls gradually fade away. This is a common technique in 2D games which simulates a sort of awareness of the environment where only the surfaces can be seen and the rest is inferred. It's useful for the gameplay because traversable areas are made clear, but it also stops the scene from becoming too visually noisy. Compare with Axiom Verge and the problem here becomes immediately apparent. The sprites are often arranged in such a way that the lighter ones denote the boundaries, but the outskirts never fade away. Most rooms are also made up entirely of 90-degree angles, which robs them of some personality. Name a room in Axiom Verge, and I have a hard time picturing its layout. Name a room in Station Alpha, and I get a clear image in my mind because it has a certain shape to it. The whole concept of these games revolves around exploring a large, seamless space, so this can actually have gameplay ramifications. When individual rooms are more memorable, it's easier to get a feel for the map as a whole. Interestingly, you could make a similar comparison between Super Metroid and Metroid 1. Maybe that's what Thomas Happ was going for, but it actually looks worse than Metroid 1 in places where different tiles are thrown in at random. It's an understandable temptation to want to break up the repetition, but at times it ends up looking like a mess. This is especially disappointing because the use of light and shadow on some of the larger objects is remarkable. Perhaps it's unfair to expect a similar level of quality across the whole game, and you could say that this clarity serves the art direction in a sense anyway. Giger's style tends to overwhelm the eye with so much detail it loses its definition. To an extent, Axiom Verge accomplishes that, so it could be worse, it's just difficult to enjoy playing a game in the middle of it sometimes. A comparison between the music of the two games is quite similar. Axiom Verge's soundtrack has more varieties of synth up its sleeve, a longer running time, and even some distorted vocal effects, but there's something to be said for the simple ambience of Station Alpha. There's an irony here because Station Alpha has a more relaxing soundtrack, but is by far the more challenging of the two. Calm music paired with difficult gameplay is a beautiful combination, two things that balance each other out. It also helps that it goes especially well with the relatively slow-paced exploration these games tend to focus on. That said, it's not as though Axiom Verge's music is bad. Far from it. It has catchier melodies, and its wobbly, pulsing synths capture the disturbing nature of Trace's new reality quite well. Part of this comes from the sprites themselves, which have their animations synced to the beat of the rhythm in each area. It's a subtle effect, but it helps to accentuate both the soundtrack and the environments. Whichever visuals or music you prefer, it's clear that Axiom Verge is a more modern take on things, while Station Alpha is firmly rooted in the past. It even uses a 4:3 viewport, resulting in black bars on the sides of widescreen displays, likely a result of engine limitations, but disappointing nonetheless. As annoying as it is to see a large portion of the screen wasted, even this can't be considered an objective flaw since there's no guarantee that displays will continue to be widescreen in the future. Maybe at some point everyone will start using perfectly square TVs or some other new standard where Station Alpha will actually fare better than the widescreen games being produced today. Stranger things have happened, but we have to admit that looks incredibly unlikely. It's a lot more sensible to design games with current display standards in mind. That's exactly the kind of Axiom Verge follows, being presented in glorious widescreen, which makes the environments feel that much more expansive and gives the player more room to scope out and respond to threats. By far the best enhancement, however, is the way it zooms out during bosses so that even the most gargantuan enemy can be easily seen in their entirety. At its most extreme, this ends up displaying about 4 times as much stuff as usual, not the kind of thing that could be done by a game which is continually taxing the hardware. This is a criminally underutilized property of these retro-inspired games, maybe because many of them are poorly optimized, so I want to take a moment to emphasize this. It's only because Axiom Verge is usually running with so much spare overhead that it's able to dramatically ramp things up when necessary. This helps to justify the simplistic pixel art beyond just aesthetic or budgetary concerns. If the graphics were rich with detail, then zooming out might make it difficult to follow the action. To put it simply, Axiom Verge takes advantage of hardware advances to present a retro-inspired game with a genuinely modern sheen. It's polished and it serves the gameplay really well during boss fights. As for the bosses themselves, they leave something to be desired. Most are complete pushovers, which mainly consist of standing in place, hammering away at a weak point, and occasionally moving slightly to avoid some projectiles. The final boss inverts this by sending out a barrage of awkward attacks, so that the go-to strategy is just to tank hits and burst it down as quickly as possible. Station Alpha, on the other hand, is packed full of challenging, unique fights that always feel fair. Yes, some attacks might catch you off guard the first time, but everything is telegraphed about as well as you could hope for. Damage can always be avoided, and players are expected to do so as much as possible before they'll be allowed to advance. While some might take several attempts to overcome, it leads to a genuine sense of accomplishment once they're defeated. There's a few contributing factors why the bosses of Station Alpha turned out better than the ones in Axiom Verge. Firstly, it comes down to a difference in their health systems. In Axiom Verge, you start with 2 pips and can find up to a maximum of 15, a 7.5 times increase. In Station Alpha, you start with 10 and can find up to a maximum of 30, a 3-fold increase. It's worth noting that Axiom Verge is actually relatively conservative in terms of health upgrades, all things considered. Super Metroid has 14 additional energy tanks and 4 reserve tanks, an 18 times increase, so Axiom Verge has less than half as many. Station Alpha, again, has half as few as Axiom Verge. The first health upgrade in Station Alpha is given for free, bringing HP up to 14, and later tanks have diminishing returns, so the general range of health is even smaller than 10 to 30. In actuality, it's more likely that players will have somewhere between 14 and 27 health by the time they finish most bosses. All in all, it can be assumed that a player going into a Station Alpha boss will have a pretty small health pool, which naturally leads to tighter balancing. If there's a chance the player is going to walk into the fight and be killed in 2 hits, then you have to make sure those hits can be reliably dodged. Just to be clear, a restrictive health system isn't a prerequisite for good bosses. Super Metroid's bosses are at least as good or better than the ones in Axiom Verge, but a well-balanced health system is a good way of keeping the designer honest. Secondly, it's worth pointing out that although the robot in Station Alpha uses a gun, mechanically it acts as a melee weapon instead of a ranged one. Upgrades push that range out further over the course of a playthrough, but it always forces players to put themselves in danger whenever they want to deal damage. Axiom Verge's vast array of weapons offer a lot of variety. Some of them are quite imaginative, some of them are difficult to find, and some are enjoyable to use. It seems, no matter what your preference, there's a gun for you, but addition only goes so far. Sometimes subtraction is key. No matter which gun you prefer, Trace will always have access to the basic blaster, which allows him to keep most enemies and bosses at screen's length. That doesn't mean the player is completely out of harm's way. Naturally enough, the bosses use ranged attacks of their own, but it does mean you're unlikely to find that satisfaction of weaving close to the enemy to deliver the final blow. At least not without some sort of self-imposed challenge anyway. Lastly, movement is another reason why bosses in Station Alpha shine. They capitalize more on the acquired upgrades. When you get the double jump, you're expected to use it to dodge attacks. The dash and vertical dash are put to similarly good use later on. There's a gradual increase in complexity which avoids overwhelming the player while slowly pushing them to do more each time. It helps that the upgrades themselves are more responsive than the ones in Axiom Verge. The Hookshot is present in both games, but the one in Station Alpha puts the other to shame. On the surface, the Axiom Verge version is actually more fully featured. You can shorten or lengthen the grapple, dangle in place, and even swing several times before letting go. Station Alpha's Hookshot carries the player's momentum though, and its simple one swing limit just makes it easier to use. You can smoothly traverse entire rooms with it and even utilize your speed to carry you places that might seem impossible at first. A similar comparison could be made between the dashes of both games. The final version of Axiom Verge's dash technically has more uses, but Station Alpha just requires a single button press, whereas Axiom Verge has a weird double tap setup which not only makes it awkward to use precisely, but also means it's possible to accidentally dash when you didn't want to. This corridor of spikes, which has to be navigated entirely by dashing, is a daunting challenge at first, but after making it to the end, I found I could repeat the entire sequence again with surprising regularity. A similar setup in Axiom Verge would be an unmitigated disaster just because of the control scheme. I had a whole diatribe here about how I thought the controls should have been laid out, but I'll spare you since there's many valid answers to that problem. The important point is that even if you can remap buttons, you can't improve the aiming or dashes because of the way they're built into the game. Station Alpha has fewer actions, but because the controls work perfectly, the bosses and environments are designed to utilize them to their fullest. That said, the upgrades you do find in Station Alpha are mostly pretty generic. A double jump, a hookshot, and a dash are all well-worn material. Axiom Verge is considerably more imaginative in this regard. The ability to phase through walls is a particularly brilliant inclusion because it recaptures a feeling that many games in this style have missed. When the earlier Metroid games were released, nobody had any idea what the upgrades would be, so when you got the grapple beam or morph bombs, that caused you to see the world in a new way. Areas you had previously ignored were suddenly accessible in a way you maybe didn't quite expect. That feeling returns in Axiom Verge. Booting it up for the first time, you're not going to be watching out for single block walls, waiting for the moment you can phase through them. Instead, you'll see some collectibles scattered around with no idea how to reach them. Then, after gaining the ability, it suddenly clicks into place. The way you see the world changes, those walls stick out more, and you suddenly realize how many of them you've obliviously walked past. This might be Axiom Verge's greatest strength, and it's an unfortunate rarity since other developers often play it too safe with upgrades. There's a sense of discovery you can't quite replicate by giving players the same power-ups in every game. The glitch gun is even more imaginative, with many enemies having unique and interesting effects that can be utilised in a variety of ways. Its only downside is that it requires a lot of experimentation to utilise properly, but you could say that reflects the exploratory nature of the rest of the game. In spite of its inventiveness, perhaps the biggest revelation in all of Axiom Verge is actually what it lacks. Anytime I start playing a game like this, the first question on my mind is, when am I going to get the double jump? Station Alpha played exactly to my expectations on this one, although to its credit, it gets the double jump out of the way as early as possible. Axiom Verge goes down a different route entirely. Instead of a double jump, you get a drone shot upgrade, which provides similar functionality, but with a lot more versatility. It would have been so easy to include a double jump anyway. Nobody would complain about another shiny bauble to collect, so it's respectable that it wasn't just thrown in there for the sake of it. You can certainly levy some complaints that Axiom Verge's identity is too closely tied to Metroid, even the lack of a double jump could be construed that way, but for the most part it does a wonderful job of creating a distinct set of power-ups even compared to other games in this quasi-genre. Another strength of Axiom Verge, partially thanks to those unique abilities, is that progress tends to be gated in a more natural and engaging way. To be fair, Station Alpha does a good job of this with its Grappling Hook too. In both of these games you're free to try hooking wherever you want, usually with success. This beats the hell out of being restricted to predefined grapple points that tell you where and when to use it. That said, Station Alpha does fall into that trap with its dash upgrades. Once you get the dash move, you can make your way past red blocks, but there's no reason for those red blocks to be there other than to get in your way, and whenever you see them, you immediately know they exist solely to be dashed past. In a way, it's not really any different from getting a red keycard or something. Axiom Verge doesn't display these things so obviously. It's up to you to keep a careful eye on the scenery and identify areas where you might want to use a certain ability. Shortly after getting the phase code for the first time, I came to this dead end on the surface, thought I was blocked, and actually turned around for a little while before remembering I could just go through it. It was a moment of idiocy on my part, but I'm incredibly glad the game let me make that mistake. phasing through that wall was all the more cathartic because it was up to me to connect the dots. That gradual exploration is the central pillar of both games, which naturally results in some backtracking. A unique appeal of Metroid-style games is eventually getting to explore those areas that were tantalizingly out of reach before. Even so, it's no surprise that many similar games offer warp points in an attempt to curb tedium. It's commendable that Axiom Verge refuses to rely on the easy answer of teleportation, but the massive tunnel is still a relatively uninteresting solution to the problem. Since there's no challenge involved here, it's more or less mechanically equivalent to having a teleporter at each end anyway. Station Alpha has a more engaging system whereby accomplishing certain objectives will activate additional enemies, making previous areas more dangerous. These fresh challenges are placed in some of the highest traffic areas, taking much of the sting out of backtracking while still preserving the appeal. Unfortunately, this great implementation is undermined a little by the inclusion of teleporters anyway. As expected, both games reward exploration with pickups, health upgrades, and story-related items that flesh out the history of the world. Both games even feature multiple endings based on how much exploring you do. Station Alpha really sticks out here because after the first ending opens up, the exploration starts to change from being action-focused to more puzzle-based. It's impressive just how many areas are hidden next to previously well-explored locales, but following a bunch of obtuse, sometimes ambiguous clues to find the next breadcrumb is a dramatic shift in gameplay. In theory, there's nothing wrong with this, but it's the kind of thing that players just won't be expecting because of how the rest of the game plays out. It can be difficult to adjust your mindset when you've seen enough to think you were basically finished already. At times, these puzzles are so difficult that it feels almost more like a community-focused challenge. If nothing else, at least this abrupt turn makes Station Alpha incredibly memorable because it's so unexpected. This is the kind of thing independent games really excel at, taking risks some people will love at the cost of alienating others. There's an admirable amount of work gone into these later sections, especially considering how well hidden they are, but it could have been framed a lot better. It's a sad reality that when a game has multiple endings, we expect one of them to be the good ending, or at the very least the true ending. Station Alpha bucks this trend. Once the poor little robot sets foot on the station, it's doomed, but there's no way to know that until you go all the way down the rabbit hole. When you get the first ending and realize there's more, you might feel as though you haven't really beaten the game because you haven't seen the good ending yet. This is the problem. The post-game content of Station Alpha was almost certainly intended to be bonus material, just for those players who really enjoy that sort of stuff, but because you don't get a good ending before it, it feels like something that everyone is supposed to go through. You could say that this is more a problem with player expectations than the game itself, but it still feels as though Station Alpha pushes too many boundaries at once. The majority of players just aren't going to be willing or able to go through all of this themselves, so a satisfying cut-off point before it would have let them close the book on their adventure and be reasonably content. To its credit, the post-game of Station Alpha is such a descent into weirdness that, in a sense, it beats Axiom Verge at its own game. Axiom Verge deserves praise for crafting a world that seems truly alien, but it looks so strange right from the very start that it struggles to find some kind of progression. Station Alpha, with its almost cutesy take on Metroid, lulls into a false sense of security before ratcheting up the madness. By the end, it goes all-out horror more than once, capturing the feeling of stumbling across some ancient, dangerous force that was better left alone. As engrossing as this can be, the plot itself is pretty threadbare. A game like this doesn't necessarily need an interesting story, but Axiom Verge manages to have one without feeling intrusive. Character interactions gradually reveal more about the situation, but are also sparse and brief enough not to become a nuisance. It only has marginally more text than Station Alpha, while managing to convey a much more rich sense of history. Optional logs contain conversations between unseen characters, oblique references to past events, and tease subjects like quantum immortality, a brain in a vat, and technological worship. It all seems relevant, and it's enough to spark the sort of conspiracy theories that'll keep fans talking as long as there's someone listening, or until a sequel elaborates further. So, while Station Alpha's unexpected descent into the unknown is more engaging moment to moment, Axiom Verge tends to linger in the mind afterwards. That about wraps things up, but before my closing thoughts, I would like to point out that as much as these games are great in their own ways, they have at least one mistake in common. Both rely on hidden areas behind otherwise normal-looking walls. Of course, secret areas should be difficult to find, but the problem is, as soon as you have one place like this, the player doesn't know how many more there are, so they're inclined to start checking every wall that looks mildly suspicious. Axiom Verge is the worst of the two for this, since the lab coat, address disruptor and drill could all conceivably reveal buried secrets, which makes it even more tedious to check each one, but it remains a problem in Station Alpha as well. To be fair to both designers, this is a true catch-22 situation of game design. So many games have relied on this trick that players are practically conditioned to look for secret areas in this way, so you could argue if the player is going to waste time doing stuff like this anyway, then you might as well reward them for it. Maybe it's worse to check every wall and find nothing, but I think foregoing these kinds of secrets entirely would have a huge benefit by allowing players to stop worrying about it on subsequent playthroughs. The save rooms of Axiom Verge are evidence that this kind of knowledge can be liberating. As far as I'm aware, there's absolutely nothing hidden in any of these rooms, so the next time you play, keep that in mind and notice what a relief it is not to have to check any of those corners. Now imagine that applied to the whole game. To be clear, I'm not advocating against secrets entirely, just that this method of hiding behind completely normal looking terrain leads to a lot of disruption. At times during this comparison it almost sounded like these two games are polar opposites, but in reality they share a lot of the same DNA. Or whatever the game design equivalent of DNA is. And DNA is just code, so... But I can't say code because they don't actually share the same code. So, they have a lot of the same metaphorical DNA, not actual DNA, because they're games, I know that. Okay, so don't say that. Anyway, when you summarize it, it boils down to some simple statements. Station Alpha is a more primitive title, but makes better use of what it's got. Axiom Verge doesn't reach all its potential, but it's more ambitious and imaginative. Their strengths and weaknesses happen to overlap in so many ways, it seems possible that some future game could inherit the best of both. Hopefully these developers, and others, can learn from the examples both games provide for each other. Even though they might be flawed in different ways, we're lucky to have them carrying the Metroid torch so adeptly. Both of these games show that there's still plenty of room for this subgenre to grow. There's a lot of exploring still left to do.